Welcome back to FlatsClass University. This is where I teach you as a full-time guide over the last 25 plus years how to become a better inshore angler. Today's lesson, we're going to learn how to fish a grass flat, but we're going to focus on potholes. Don't know what a pothole is? Look at this slide here. You'll see a grass flat and then you'll see three large potholes. Within those potholes is a habitat that is created. It's an ambush point for predators. It's a place that collects bait fish, especially small minnow fry, pinfish, occasionally some bigger mullet on some lower tide phases. But it mostly creates an ambush point. And we're going to talk about all of that right now. All right, we're going to talk about fishing grass flats for those of us that are primarily targeting redfish and speckled trout. So I've got a side view down here of the architecture of a pothole, and then this would be a top view, looking down, bird's eye view, if you will. When I work a grass flat that has these potholes that kind of inundate the zone, I'm always will make believe that we're the magnet, whether you're in a kayak or a skiff or what have you, or wade fishing. We're going to work into the flow. So we want the flow as it's depicted here coming this way. And the reason we want that is because the fish are oriented head first into that flow, the game fish, and that is what these shapes here are. These are game fish, and then these little dashes here represent minnow schools, things like that. These might be mullet in here with these game fish in the pothole. This purple ring that is outlining the pothole is this deeper grass architecture right here, because when you're looking bird's eye view at a pothole, you just see, let's just say you're in the tower of your boat or you're standing up on your paddle, you just see the sand. That's the sandy depression right there. That's all you see. You don't realize that there's an area of grass that goes down, almost cones into that zone. That is what makes a pothole valuable to predators, because this little zone right here, that little gradual slope that I've drawn in here, is generally where the ambush happens, where the predator meets the prey. As this current sweeps across the flat, and the middle third of the tide is when the flat is the most, I'm going to say, active and presents the best feeding opportunity. So if you have three levels of tide, you have, let's just say over here, I'll draw it out for you. You have the low tide third, you have the mid tide, and then you have the high tide. It's this middle part of the tide where this sheet flow is going to be the strongest. That is when potholes are likely going to be the most valuable. You may have never been shown this, but because these pieces of structure, that's what potholes are. They're natural features in the bottom, so they have a topographic nature to them. That's why we call them structure, not cover. The grass is actually the cover. And I have a whole video on that you can find here on the channel. Now, this grass, this sloping edge creates a lot of ambush points within this pothole. And the pothole, when deep enough, let's just say this one here is 3 foot deep. When that sheet flow is coming over the top of the pothole, if that fish is sitting down here on the bottom, he can rest and be out of the current. So there are times when you have a high barometer, that typically happens in the winter and early spring when we have fronts close together, or you just have a situation where the water's cold. These fish will sit down here out of the tide and just sun. So if you see fish in the center of the pothole, they're not always feeding. It's like, oh wow, we've got them locked in the pothole, they're feeding. Occasionally they are. But many times they're not feeding at all. In fact, I'd say more than 50% of the time they're not feeding. It's these fish that sit on these edges of the pothole that are the ones that are more likely to feed. Now, if you've got a smaller pothole, and potholes vary in size. I mean, some of them you could have a pickup truck size pothole or bigger. And then other potholes are no bigger than the size of a manhole cover. When you have those smaller manhole cover ones, yes, those fish are going to feed because the edge surrounds them all the way around. So that fish there could feed in that hole. In this scenario where you have a much larger pothole, or where you saw it in the slide, that giant pothole, you could have a whole group of fish inside that pothole that are just sitting there doing nothing. And the bait is going to feel comfortable around it. That's one of the clues, because the bait does not want to get into a pothole when they know the fish are in the mood to eat. And that's why these little bait fish schools up here are in between the potholes. Now that flow is eventually going to force them across that pothole, and then these fish are going to feed. But here's how you place a cast. First, I'm going to show you where you shouldn't cast. You should not cast into the pothole itself. So if you're thinking, I'm moving in, I'm getting close, and you're a little impatient, and you launch a cast, and it lands like in here somewhere, okay? Or even if you think you're doing a great job and you land on the edge over here, that's still not great. Here's why. You've got all this line laying over the top of these fish, and believe it or not, braid is going to silhouette over the top of a pothole. If you have it laying over the top of them and you're bouncing that stuff, and those shadows in there are just where that fish can tell, you're telegraphing that something's coming by, they usually just get out of the way. That's what they do, they just get out of the way. You know, back in the old days, we'd throw mono or something like that and it wasn't as obvious to them. But braid, definitely obvious, especially if you're throwing heavier braid, something like 15 or 20 pound braid, or even higher if you're a casting reel guy. So what I like to do is I don't like to make that cast. Plus, just the entry of that lure, if you're back at this position, just launching it and it dropping in like that, hitting, and the ripple effect, it's not the right cast. I'm going to just leave it at that. It's not the right cast. It's not the smartest cast. So if you take those casts away, because all you're going to do is waste a bunch of your prime potholes where fish are staged up in the middle part of that tide. Instead, if you were to make a cast, let's just say all the way over here, okay, a long cast, so you make a long cast, then what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to work, you see how it's going through all that prime edge as you work that lure back? By making the longer cast, you're hitting exactly the edges that you need to. That purple and black line there, you're getting all that good stuff right along there. You're not telegraphing with that popping motion of the rod with the line bouncing, because there's no stretch in braid and most of you are using braid. Bounce, bounce, bounce. Or even if you're just reeling it, you're able to reel it through these edges where the more likely game fish is going to ambush your lure. So that is the smart cast right there. You're trying to hit that edge. You're getting as much of the edge of the potholes as you can. Another great cast would probably be somewhere over here, and then you would be able to go right along the edge of that hole, and then you'd catch a big portion of the edge of this hole as it works back. Those are the best casts, bar none. And I'm going to explain why you want to land that far away from that hole. When you make a long cast, you lose a little bit of the control unless you're feathering the line with your finger. You lose a little bit of the control of how hard it's going to land. So you want to make sure that you're landing a good distance away from the intended path of the lure. That way, when the bait hits the water, and most of us when we're fishing grass flats are either Texas rigged in some type of weedless fashion or fishing a really shallow running bait, maybe a hard bait like a Mirrolure or something that is not gonna like hit the water and sink right down into the grass. It's not like a lead head jig head. And as soon as it does that, you're gonna try to get the lure speed right. You're gonna try to clear the plug, make sure there's no grass on it, and then you're gonna just start rolling that jig or plug or whatever you're working. And you're going to work it in a fashion where you can be in a good, let's just say a really good rhythm by the time you reach this point here. You'll be in a really good rhythm by the time you reach this point here. That way you get the benefit of it all. If you were to land right on the hole, by the time you get it going, you're halfway through the hole or a third of the way through the hole, and you've made a bunch of I'm gonna just say, crowd noise, which would freak the fish out. So don't do that. This is the way you approach this every time, and you'll do great. A lot of you say, well, if those were the first 2 casts that you made, what would be cast number 3? Well, it depends, okay? But if you wanted to clear the center of that hole, feeling like, hey, this is the middle of the tide, these fish might feed, and you want to pick up another bait, something that might be a high floating bait, if there were 3 feet of water in that, maybe you're working a top water or unweighted jerk shad, you could make a cast up current up here, okay, and then work it down the center of the group like that, just to be sure that they wouldn't eat. But that would be cast 3, that would be cast 1, and that would be cast 2 to optimize. If you've ever watched the video I did on how to fish a dock like a pro, well, this is how to fish a grass flat like a pro. You want to hit all the best stuff first. And then if you want to go for the heart of the hole, like I said, the heart of the dock, then you can go for that in the very end. And then you clear these holes out. I always try to work it out where I can line up a hole or 2 or 3 that are close together where I can get the maximum amount of edge. I want to cover the maximum amount of edge on these casts. That's always key to me. If you can do that and work this zone the most, rather than what everybody else is doing is throwing right in the middle, you will catch more fish, because that's where the ambush predators generally are set up. Remember, this pothole thing is one of the best features in a grass flat. Occasionally you'll find a shell bar or maybe a down piece of old limestone, some rock or a point or something like that. But most of the time in coastal estuaries, you will realize that these potholes are what game fish use. They change the flow of water moving across the flat. They're great spots to collect bait, because as this water goes down, you get into the lowest part of the tide, and this water gets down into here. Well, it's going to force all the bait in that hole as well. Now, if it gets too low, the game fish will leave, but the bait fish will stay in there for the whole tide, because there'll always be enough water in there for them. And it's just an easy place for game fish to hunt, because they don't have to try to find them in all this cover in the grass, which is tough. When that water really starts flowing, it lays that grass over, it pulls that bait out. Shrimp are out, pipe needlefish are out, seahorses are out, you know, crabs, shrimp, fry minnow, everything's coming through those holes. And that's why those fish hunt those edges like that. They're just like a pack of coyotes. If this type of breakdown is helping your fishing, you should try what we have over there at FlatsClassUniversity.com. We go into much more structured and deeper dives into this type of stuff with satellite overlays, and really hone this thing down so you know where to fish, when to fish, and how to fish it. That's all I have for you today. Hopefully, I'll see you right back here in my virtual classroom tomorrow.